Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, and to Generals McKenzie and Townsend, thank you for your service and for your frequent and always illuminating appearances before the committee. General Townsend, I want to talk to you about a situation that's not getting a lot of attention in the media these days, and that is the humanitarian crisis and war crimes being committed by many sides in Ethiopia and the Tigray region. The ongoing battle, 20 months now, between the Ethiopian military and the Tigray region forces has created a huge humanitarian crisis, war crimes, famine. It is important that we focus as much energy as we are focusing on the situation in Ukraine right now. But one of the things that I grieve a little bit is when we focus on one part of the world, atrocities in other parts of the world sort of go below the radar screen. And so whether it's in Ethiopia and Tigray, or whether it's persecution of the Rohingyas in Burma, or whether it's the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Yemen, some of these crises grab the world's attention, grab America's attention, and some of these crises don't. And there's many, many reasons for that. I'm not going to speculate on them now, but in a situation like the ongoing atrocities in Ethiopia, which are internal civil strife, although there are presence of foreign actors inciting that strife or supporting sides in that strife, what can Africom do? What can the United States do to try to advance a better chapter for people of Ethiopia?
Thanks, Senator. As you stated, that civil war erupted in the late 2020, and so a civil war played out for over a year there on top of a humanitarian crisis there, famine, et cetera. And it started culminating there at the end of last year. It looked like the capital, Addis, may fall. The Ethiopian government rallied, and they pushed the Tigrayans back into Tigray. And today it's sort of quiet, but we think we're maybe in a period in between conflict erupting again. I hope that's not the case. I know that there's a lot of diplomacy going on. There's a U.S. special envoy. There's a UN special envoy to work this. I think both sides right now are trying to reset themselves and gather strength. And this diplomacy includes our efforts as well. We've been involved in supporting State Department diplomatic efforts in the region. But right now, for Africom, we're watching and assisting, buttressing the State Department.
I appreciate that, and I just want to, again, underline this point. When there's crises and challenges in the world, people turn to the United States for help. It is interesting that, again, and it's worthy and important that we be paying the attention we're paying to the Russian illegal war against Ukraine. And yet, in Ethiopia, there are war crimes occurring. There's genocidal activity occurring. It may not be an invasion of sovereignty by a neighbor, but there are neighbors in other nations that are inciting violence and supporting violence. And, I hope that we may all strive to be even-handed in the attention that we pay to humanitarian crises all over the world. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Kane. Let me now recognize Senator Tuberville, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you guys for your service. I know you're looking forward to doing something else possibly for the next few years. General Townsend, as you mentioned in your testimony, Russia has continued to encourage chaos in the Africom AOR via the Wagner Group. What has been done to counter their efforts, and what do you think needs to be continued to be done?
So the Russian efforts, as I mentioned earlier, predominantly done through these private military companies like Wagner, and they're present in Libya in number, to a lesser extent in Sudan. They essentially run the Central African Republic. and they're now in Mali and in gathering strength in Mali, over 1,000 Wagner operators there now. What we've been doing is shining a spotlight on that with information operations and some public diplomacy, and advising our African partners to try to steer clear of these groups. I think that they are not going to help our African partners, and I think that the government and the people of Mali are going to regret inviting Wagner into their country.
As we speak, we have one military base in Africa. In your opinion, do we need two?
In my view, I don't believe we do need any other permanent U.S. installations. Our presence and our activities there is not dependent on permanent bases in Africa.
Okay, thank you. General McKenzie, recently we've seen several attempts to block weapons sales to Saudis and UAE and Egypt. Those attempts could, we all know, could severely weaken, our influence in Centcom AOR. Even President Biden recognizes that, and has changed his mind on some of these in the last year. What have the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians specifically requested that we haven't given them?
Senator, let me just begin by saying we remain the partner of choice for all these countries. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they value their relationship with us. They find it frustrating that if they, in the case of UAE, they've expressed an interest in the F-35, fifth-generation fighter, and we're in a process with them right now to see how that's going to work out. That's one example. Saudi Arabia is also interested in advanced aircraft, advanced air defense systems, which generally speaking, we've been able to give Saudi Arabia. In the case of Egypt, I think we have good news in that we're going to provide them with F-15s, which was a long, hard slog. They felt it was too long. It took too long. And Senator, that's the basic criticism of our ability to provide weapons to our friends and partners. It takes too long to actually get them. It moves in fits and starts. And, of course, with our weapons come our values, Senator, and so they're not going to be able to do anything they want with those weapons. They're going to have to be applied in a manner consistent with the law of armed conflict and the law of war. You don't have that caveat if you buy a Russian or a Chinese system. On the other hand, the Russia and the Chinese system cannot compete with the ability of an American system. Thank you.
General Townsend, in 2021, China unveiled its plan to complete several thorium-powered nuclear reactors in Africa. Thorium, unlike uranium, cannot be used for nuclear weapons, but can provide cheap, clean energy that China can export and impose on low-income countries. The most concerning part of this to me is we realized this years ago, but our Department of Energy gave this technology to China. As you mentioned in your opening statement, that there are many reasons and resources within your AR that are tied to the U.S. transition to clean energy. If China integrates thorium nuclear reactors to the Belt and Road Initiative, would that pose a threat to the United States?
Senator, I don't know enough about the Chinese nuclear reactor program to say that it proposes a threat to the United States. However, I know that Africa is a source of vast deposits of strategic minerals that America and the world needs for our technology in the 21st century. And China is working hard to corner the market on those resources. I'm more worried about that, I think, than Chinese nuclear energy projects in Africa.
Again, thank you both of you for your service. Mr.
Thank you very much, Senator Tuberville. Let me now recognize Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today and for your many years of service to our nation. The RAND Corporation, a nonpartisan research organization that studies national security issues, recently published a report that found a number of pitfalls in the way that our military prevents, investigates, and responds to reports of civilian harm, including, and I want to read from the report, DOD is not adequately organized, trained, or equipped to fulfill its current responsibilities for addressing civilian harm, end quote. Now, I think that's a pretty damning finding, particularly as this is far from a new issue for the United States. I know that Secretary Austin has asked DOD to develop an action plan, and I agree with him that protection of civilians is both a strategic and a moral imperative. So I want to learn more about your work to prevent civilian harm in your respective commands. General Townsend, if I can, I'll start with you on this. Africom provides a quarterly report updating the public on the status of all reports of civilian casualties, and it issued one just late last week. What benefit do you see in regular reporting of civilian casualties to the public?
Senator, I believe that being transparent is probably, it shows the difference between us and, well, for example, the Russians in Ukraine right now. So I believe that publishing those reports publicly and regularly on a routine basis is our best tool for gaining the trust of the American public.
And I agree with you, and I commend you for doing this. You know, that kind of regular transparency shows that the command is prioritizing and investigating claims of civilian harm. And I'd like to see that kind of regular reporting from all of the combatant commanders. So, General, now let me ask you another question about this. Would you agree that there are several reputable, trusted NGOs and independent observers in civil society that produce reliable reporting on civilian harm?
I think I would.
Good. Has Africom undertaken a formal process to incorporate feedback from these groups to improve how it tracks and responds to civilian harm?
Yes, Senator, we take their feedback with every report they make.
Well, that's important, and I think, but let me ask you, do you have a formal process for doing this, or are you just kind of integrated as you go along?
We have a portal that anyone that has access to the internet can report civilian casualties or take exception to our evaluation of those.
Good. I'm glad to hear this. You know, these groups can provide essential information not only to accurately identify where you need to investigate claims of civilian harm, but also to help in prevent the killing of civilians in future strikes. RAND's report recommended that DOD engage with outside groups more, and I'm glad to see you doing this. General McKenzie, if I can, let me talk with you a minute here. The vast majority of the civilian casualties caused by the U.S. military operations have occurred in Centcom's AOR. Not only that, but reporting from the New York Times found major instances of civilian harm in Syria that had been covered up. Does Centcom have an established process for incorporating feedback from trusted civil society groups to improve the ways that it prevents and responds to instances of civilian harm?
Senator, we did, and it was not as robust, it's a straightforward a program as it should have been. In the wake of the RAND report and other reports, we've taken 10 discrete actions that are designed all to more formalize and provide additional oversight on the possibility of civilian casualties.
Good. I'm very glad to hear that, General, because given their expertise, I think we have a lot to learn from these groups, and it can help improve processes. And it's long past time that the United States took seriously the impact of the way that it treats civilian harm. And I'm glad that Secretary Austin is addressing this, but meaningful change is going to take buy-in from the two of you, from your successors, and from the rest of the DOD leadership. I'm working on legislation to address these problems, but in the meantime, I'll be paying close attention to the department's action plan and to your work implementing it in the hopes that some of the principles that we've talked about today will be implemented soon. So thank you very much. Thank you for your work on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Tillis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. General Townsend, prior administration reduced nearly all of the 700 troops that we had in Somalia. Now you're commuting from Djibouti and Kenya for counterterrorism, over-the-horizon operations. How is that working now, and what are we going to do to increase effectiveness and reduce risk?
Senator, in my view, we are marching in place at best. We may be backsliding the security in Somalia, the security situation. And that's for a number of reasons, not just our commuting to work, but it's also political dysfunction in Mogadishu. It's also inactivity by the Somali, by the AMISOM partners. Those also factor in. I just think that what we're doing is not providing sufficient pressure, and the best we can do is maintain a secure area around the bases that we return to, and we really can't get at the al-Shabaab problem set.
General McKenzie, you had a similar challenge with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we haven't seen any strikes since our withdrawal last year. I suspect some of that's information gathering, a lot of logistical challenges, but what are we doing there to overcome the massive reduction in our CT efforts in Afghanistan? And if you could, give me an update on how ISIS and al-Qaeda are doing rebuilding their efforts in Afghanistan.
Senator, let me preface what I'm going to say by saying in the closed session that will follow, I'm prepared to provide an exhaustive laydown of exactly what we're doing in Afghanistan at a very granular level of detail. So I'm prepared to do that.
Great.
But I would tell you, we have not undertaken any strikes in Afghanistan since the 1st of September. We continue to watch carefully as ISIS grows. They've gone through the winter. They've been able to carry out some high-profile attacks. They still aspire to attack the United States and our partners abroad. And so we're going to watch very carefully what the Taliban is able to do and not able to do in terms of controlling ISIS. Because as we all know, Taliban actually will fight ISIS, and they have a theological dispute, and so they are in opposition. Al-Qaeda is a little more difficult to understand because of their cultural interweaving with the Taliban. They still have an aspirational desire to attack us. It will be harder for the Taliban, I predict, to ultimately control their actions.
That was with Haqqani's and the Taliban government. How well are they doing countering the al-Qaeda threat in Afghanistan?
I think they've taken some, they've done some things that are very public in order to limit them. I think it remains to be seen if that's actually going to be translated into action.
Yeah. I doubt that it will. General Townsend, when you look at these maps that you have about the footprint and your area of responsibility for Russia and China, are we kind of use the words marching in place with respect to the CT threat? In answer to the prior question, are we more or less marching in place, or are we gaining any ground, particularly over China's what I see is a massive investment and increasing footprint in Africa?
Senator, you're right. You just said China's massive investment. We don't have to compete with China everywhere. We have to be selective about where we compete with China. And I think we are being successful in that targeted competition.
On the PMCs that Russia has, the 4,000 or 5,000, you mentioned that a part of what you're doing is exposing their activities, their malign activities in the area. Give me an example of one or two that are publicly known that the American people should be aware of, that Russia is a malign, savage influence, not only in Ukraine, but down in Africa.
I think some great examples were in spring of 20, when Russia provided fighters to their mercenaries in Libya, and we were able to conduct an aerial photography ambush and expose to the world the provision of those fighters going to Libya that wound up in the hands of Wagner. I think probably the best one, though, to get at the heart of the matter you're talking about there is as the fighting ended, the civil war ended in Libya, Wagner began a withdrawal from along the line of contact there, and they left behind anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, and booby traps, IEDs, in their wake. And one of the most heinous ones was found in a teddy bear when they withdrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Tillis. Senator Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General McKenzie, General Townsend, thank you for being here. General McKenzie, congratulations on your upcoming retirement on the 1st of April. General Townsend, I want to follow up on a question that Senator Tillis and Tuberville asked specifically about the Wagner Group. I know, that you share this committee's concern about the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine, and our allies have come together to cut off Putin's support around the world and the influence that he has. And I'm really glad we've taken these strong measures. It's necessary, and we need to do more. But we also need to continue to monitor Russian-backed activity around the world. So specifically with regards to the Wagner Group in Africa, I find this increasing presence disturbing and affects our strategic goals in the area. So, General, specifically, how do you see the Wagner Group's activity impacting our efforts to, one, suppress violent extremist groups, and two, support a transition to democratic governance in the region?
Thanks, Senator. I think in a number of ways. First, for example, overflight permissions. So with a continent as vast as Africa, we absolutely depend on air movement for everything. And when you see Wagner move in, they impose overflight restrictions, either through the government withdrawing permissions for overflight, or in the case of Libya, Wagner importing sophisticated advanced surface-to-air missile systems to protect their activities there, but also deny the airspace. We can see some of this playing out in Mali as Wagner first started arriving there, and now overflight permissions are becoming more challenging there. Then secondly, usurping partnerships. So as we've seen, and just happened just now in Mali, the Malian government has asked the French forces to depart and instead have invited in this Russian PMC. And I think that is disturbing. It's impacting our partnership with that same government as well. And I think that's not good for Mali's future.
And what do you think the strategic goals that they might be advancing for Russian leadership would be? Like, what's the overall goal here?
So for Wagner, they are guns for hire. They're a for-profit organization, and they are going to be extracting natural resources out of Africa. And we see this in all the countries that they're located in, whether it's oil, gas, gold, diamonds, strategic minerals. That's what they're going to be going after, and that's how they're probably going to earn their remittance. But at what they're doing for the Kremlin, though, is they're usurping those partnerships. They're displacing Western influence, like France, for example, in Mali. And I think that's what they're trying to block us out, and Wagner's trying to make a profit while they do it.
And it sounds like they're being somewhat successful. So what do we need to be doing? What kind of changes do we need to make, either alone or with our partners, to counter this expanding Russian influence in the region?
Senator, despite their recent gain or success in Mali, and I think that remains to be seen whether they're going to be successful there or not. I predict they will not be successful in the long run. An example, though, is in Libya, where they have worn out their welcome there, and the Libyans, even the Libyans who the Russians supported in the civil war, now want them to depart. So actually, I think that they're probably their own worst enemy.
So the Libyan people are now against this, I don't want to call it an occupation, but this force being there and amongst the community. It seems that in Mali, they do have support, general support from the public. Do you see that turning at some point?
I do, and I think we're in their very early stages. They've only been arriving in the last couple of months, and they're preparing to get under operations. So I think that they will wear out their welcome. I do believe that.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Cotton, please.
I want to return to what Senator Kelly and earlier Senator Rounds were speaking about, the Wagner Group. General McKenzie, the Wagner Group is a Russian paramilitary organization run by Evgeny Prigozhin, a close ally of Vladimir Putin.
Sir, I believe it is, Senator.
And I know that they're active in Africa. There's also been reports that they've recently been deployed into Ukraine as well. I'll give this to either one of you. The Wagner Group, is it fair to characterize it as essentially an arm of the Russian state?
That's my view of it.
Yeah, that's my view of it too. Much more so than, say, any American security company would be linked to the United States government, correct, General Townsend?
I would agree with that.
General McKenzie, this is a year before your time, but I bet you remember it, something called the Battle of Qashm in Syria. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what happened in Syria in early 2018?
Well, I believe it was in February of that year. A large group of Wagner-centered fighters tried to cross the Euphrates River down around Deir ez-Zor. We brought them under fire and killed several hundred of them. It was a direct attack on us, and I think we defeated them in a pretty shocking manner that was widely reported.
Do you remember the numerical superiority that these Wagner mercenaries had against U.S. forces?
It was probably 10 to 1.
10 to 1, they outnumbered U.S. forces.
Probably.
I believe at the time, probably still do, we had a deconfliction hotline set up with Russian commanders in the region, right?
That is correct, Senator.
And Secretary Mattis at the time testified that we used that deconfliction hotline to ensure with Russian counterparts that these were not Russian soldiers. Is that right?
Sir, I believe that's correct.
Yeah, I think his exact testimony here was that once we confirmed that Russian did not claim these soldiers as their own, I ordered that they be destroyed, and they were destroyed.
Sir, that's correct.
What do you think that tells us about the quality of Wagner's mercenaries, whether they're in Syria, Africa, or now in Ukraine?
Well, I think it tells you that any mercenary force is going to have a qualitative disadvantage. It also tells you a lot about our capabilities, Senator.
Yeah, and also if they're fighting against an extremely determined people that are digging in their heels to defend their homeland, like the Ukrainian army, that maybe we shouldn't think that they or even Russian regulars are 10 feet tall.
Sir, I couldn't agree more.
General Townsend, I want to return to something that you mentioned to Senator Tuberville, that Africa has vast strategic minerals, which is correct. It's also the case that they're not exclusive to Africa. You can find these minerals in a lot of places around the world. It's just that we have largely declined to mine them around the world, and now it's predominantly mined in Africa. Is that right?
That's right, Senator.
Senator Kelly and I have introduced something called the Reshore Act with goals to shore up domestic and defense supply chains for these critical minerals. Do you think that China is targeting these minerals in its Belt and Road Initiative in Africa?
I do. There are some minerals, and I think I didn't provide the chart now, but I can have it in closed session. There are some minerals that are, if not unique to Africa, they are predominantly found there, and all of our countries, to include us, rely on those imports.
Yeah.
And I believe China is maneuvering to secure those.
Probably a bad idea to make ourselves dependent on China, ourselves being the civilized world, dependent on China mining these minerals in Africa, wouldn't you say?
I would agree.
Okay. General McKenzie, I want to turn to a topic that Senator Reid and Senator King addressed as well, about a nuclear deal with Iran. They both asked you kind of in the abstract if it's better to have a nuclear deal with Iran that prevents them from getting a nuclear weapon, irrespective of their aggression in the region. In the abstract, I would agree with that, and I think you did as well. But the deal actually needs to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon or becoming a threshold state to achieve that goal, right?
Senator, I would agree. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and I would say that just like the 2015 deal did not achieve that objective, certainly the media reports about the directions of the current negotiations wouldn't achieve that objective either. What kind of message are we sending to both Iran and Russia, who's acting as Iran's lawyer in these negotiations, and to allies like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia when Iran is itself shooting ballistic missiles into Erbil, as they did over the weekend, or supplying, as you said, their proxies in Yemen with the missiles and drones to shoot into downtown Dubai or downtown Abu Dhabi or into the Al Dhafra base where we have soldiers? What kind of message does that send to Iran and Russia on the one hand and our allies like?
Senator, the primary, my share of the task is to deter Iran from large-scale attacks. And we have had some success doing that. Our success has not been perfect, but Iran has largely been deterred from launching direct attacks on us over the past couple of years. I wouldn't speak for the future, and I would agree that they're actively fomenting malign activities across the region. Their intent is to do it at a low enough level that it will not, in their view at least, disrupt the negotiating process. It is my judgment that's a dangerous position for them to have.
And, well, that would be the intent usually of weaker revisionist powers throughout history, to always operate right below the level of retaliation and to therefore gradually accumulate more strategic advantage, right?
Sir, it's an asymmetric approach that's founded in history, as you noted.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Kramer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here and for your service. I want to drill down a little bit on where we just wrapped up General McKenzie with Senator Cotton as he ran out of time. I guess for me, there are a couple of things. And by the way, your characterization of Centcom as the land of imperfect solutions describes the United States Senate as well. And we do better to realize that sometimes as a body. But anyway, that said, there are a couple of things specific to, I think, where Senator Cotton was going and where you were going. One are the timelines themselves. The sunsets create almost an implication of license to accumulate the very thing we're trying to prevent them from getting. There's that, and then there's just how to compel compliance. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit for me, a better understanding of the relief of sanctions. Again, getting back to Senator King asked the relevant question in the give and take. So that the sanctions relief that provides money, and then the time that the sunsets provide, how are we balancing that right? Maybe that's the way to ask the question.
Sir, I would defer to the Department of State and to our negotiators for the details on that. But I would tell you, just from where I sit, my guidance is clearly we don't want Iran to possess a nuclear weapon. And so that the best way to get to that solution is for them to agree not to pursue it. They may be closer than we like when we reach that level of agreement. Don't know. That's a matter for the diplomats, not for me.
Let me ask this, and in your opinion, do you think that the IRGC belongs on the foreign terrorist organization list, and should that be under consideration in this negotiation?
Well, from everything that I can see from where I sit, the IRGC is a terrorist organization.
Well, I'd say you have a pretty good seat, a pretty good view of that. So thank you for that. I also then want to, none of these, by the way, were in my original list of things to talk about, but you, in response to, I think it was Senator Tuberville, you talked about the other relationships, the allied relationships. You specifically brought up F-35 sales to UAE, for example, as an example. And you talked about the long slog. Specific to the UAE and F-35s, and in fact, let me back up a second. I just read a report, I can't keep track of my weeks, either earlier this week or I think it was last week, reports of leadership, UAE, Saudi leadership, not even taking phone calls from U.S. leadership as a result of some of this. Do you think the F-35 sale to UAE should have gone through sooner, and should we be doing it as soon as possible? Should we, what are the ramifications if we don't do it in this, imperfect solution world you live in?
Well, I think in general, anytime we undertake weapon sales to a foreign nation, you want to do it as soon as practically possible. In an advanced system like the F-35, and I'm not an expert on the procurement and delivery of that weapon system, it's going to take some time to get there. It's not a system that you can build rapidly beyond the existing scale of production, so it's going to take some time to be there. But I think our friends sometimes find it frustrating when the timeline slips and goes on well into the future.
So, do you have a basic philosophy of how you have the appropriate guardrails in our system that provides a comfort level for your overseers, who have to provide a comfort level for the people we work for, and and then maintaining those relationships?
Sir, I can talk more about it in the closed session, but briefly, the answer is yes, I am comfortable with those guardrails.
All right, thank you, General McKenzie. General Townsend, in my last minute, just some questions of my favorite topic. And I honestly, we all, I think, struggle with the maintenance of legacy systems and making room for modern systems, particularly in the ISR realm. So I'm just going to ask you a very open-ended question. Are you getting the ISR you need? Are you concerned about any gaps in ISR coverage? And do you have any thoughts or literally and seriously and sincerely any thoughts for us as we consider the balance of all of that?
Thanks, Senator. No combatant commander has the ISR they wish to have. Africom does the best work we can with the ISR that were allocated. I could certainly use more ISR. Your point about the legacy ISR systems and transitioning to more capable systems, I think that's something that our nation's doing and our services are doing for the future. We have to do that because we need platforms that are more capable against the higher-end competitors. However, in theaters like mine, and even General McKenzie's, the legacy ISR systems that we have work just fine. We don't need exquisite high-end capabilities to do the work we're doing in Africa, but I do understand why our department needs those for other theaters.
Appreciate you both. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Rosen, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed and Ranking Member Inhofe for holding this hearing. I'd also like to thank Generals McKenzie and Townsend for testifying today and, of course, for your service to our country. And General McKenzie, as this will be the last time before our committee, thank you for your decades of distinguished service to our nation, for leading the brave men and women of our armed forces and navigating the many challenges within Central Command. Thank you. And General McKenzie, I want to talk a little bit about combating Iranian aggression. As I've noted in several previous hearings, Iran and Iranian-backed militia groups are increasingly targeting U.S. installations and service members in both Iraq and Syria via drone and rocket attacks. We don't even have to look beyond this weekend when the IRGC claimed credit for missile attacks on the U.S. consulate in Erbil. On a regular basis, Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, threatens U.S. and allied interests in the Middle East and around the world via both direct attacks like the ones we just witnessed and through its support for Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic's other terrorist proxies. So can you discuss the threat Iranian-aligned militia groups in the Middle East pose to U.S. troops and our allies, and how do you believe the U.S. should respond? How are you addressing the threat, and does Centcom have the necessary authorities to target these militias other than the ability to act in self-defense?
Senator, first of all, you're right. Iran is foments a particularly virulent form of anti-Americanism across the theater. It is a long-term objective of Iran for the United States to be forced to exit the region. Mm-hmm. They see the principal battleground for that as being Iraq, because that's where we're the most distributed, that's where we're the most vulnerable. And for the last couple of years, they've actually tried to pursue a political solution to that. That has not worked out for them. The seated government of Iraq is interested in maintaining a long-term relationship with the United States and, in fact, with NATO. And what that has done is it has driven Iran and its proxies in particular, to seek kinetic solutions to push us out. They believe that by causing a significantly high level of pain, we're going to leave. Mm-hmm. And that actually, of course, has not proven to be the case. For one thing, over the past several months, they have attacked us. Mm-hmm. They have not been particularly successful with those attacks. And there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, commanders on the ground, our commanders on the ground, have been very aggressive in protecting their men and women by actions that we take when we learn of an impending attack. Second, our anti-drone systems are beginning to work. It's taken us a while to get to this point, but I'm gratified to see that capability coming forward. And finally, their own attacks have not always been the most artfully conceived and executed. One point I would make, we do not believe the attack of this last weekend, the ballistic missiles, was actually targeted against us. We believe it was going against other targets, hit near us, and the effect would have been the same, and I can talk more about in the closed session. But in order to close out your question, ma'am, I do have the authorities I need to act in U.S. Central Command against Iranian proxies should the threat require me to do that.
Thank you. I want to move on a little bit to Israel. And now that Israel is within Centcom's area of responsibility, it is my sincere hope that this transfer will potentiate even greater military cooperation between U.S., Israel, and our shared goals, as well as greater cooperation between our Arab and Israeli partners. So, Senator McKenzie, building on Senator Gillibrand's question on leveraging the Abraham Accords, are there plans to integrate joint exercises with Israel and Arab states who've signed normalization agreements with Israel? And what do you see as the greatest benefits and opportunities to Israeli inclusion in CENTCOM?
Senator, I would say that bringing Centcom into the AOR really operationalizes the Abraham Accord and sort of puts a military component to the broad normalization that is already proceeding with Israel and many of its Arab neighbors. Now, in terms of practical things we can do right now, number one is integrated air and missile defense. Everyone in the region is seized by the Iranian threat, and they want to be able to defend themselves against that threat. And that threat is primarily in the air. That's where setting aside the proxies, which we talked about, is primarily Iran's ballistic missiles, their cruise missiles, and their UASs. So that's a significant issue for nations in the region. Israel is going to be able to assist us in all of those areas. Additionally, in specific answer to your question, we have been and will continue to expand Israel's participation in exercises across the region. That's an invaluable tool for getting partners to know each other, and laying plans for the future.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I have questions for the record for General Townsend about Chinese technology in Africa. We'll submit them for the record. Thank you both.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Blackburn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for being with us today. General McKenzie, I want to go back to this Iran deal because the threat assessment, the annual threat assessment, noted that they anticipated that Iran would continue to threaten U.S. interests, U.S. individuals. I've read public reports of them threatening you. I know that this Iran deal would unlock billions of dollars for Iran, and I'm very concerned about what they would do with that money. They've already recently, in the recent past, the past decade, $16 billion is what we know of that they have transferred to these terrorist groups. So the IRGC, you mentioned, as Senator Rosen just talked about the attack this week, but Iran goes in to fill these power vacuums. We have seen, and we've talked a good bit about Africom and Wagner and the way they're filling that. And General Kurilla, when he was with us for his confirmation hearing, touched on the risk that sanctions relief to Iran would make to us and to our interest because of this money transfer. And do you agree with General Kurilla as we're talking about a new JCPOA or a new Iran deal and unleashing all of this money to them? Are you concerned about that and how that would be used by these proxy groups and the way they would benefit from that?
Senator, our primary policy objective with Iran is to prevent them from having a nuclear weapon,
And we realize that and appreciate that.
And so I am not an expert on the negotiations that are currently going on. So I am not able to give you
your expectation they would be more lethal, that they would move forward with
It is.
developing?
I would say that there is a risk that they could use that money in ways that we would not want them to use that money. I can certainly say that is a risk, but I think that we would have to balance that if we got a good agreement that prevented them from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
Okay. All right. So I know that the JCPOA, under the terms for that, they could buy weapons from Russia and China as of October 2020, and they would be able to buy advanced weaponry and ballistic missiles from Russia next year. So what is your concern about their ability to purchase arms from Russia or China? Would they be able to purchase even more lethal weapons if they get that sanctions release? And how what would that do with the capabilities for the Houthis or for any of these other terrorist organizations?
Senator, over the last 4 or 5 years, under a very significant sanctions regime, Iran has made remarkable advances in their ballistic missiles. I believe if open to bringing in advanced weapons from other states, such as you have named, it would increase the risk in the theater considerably.
Have we provided everything to the Israeli government that they've requested in order to respond to an Iranian nuclear buildup?
Senator, at my level, at the Chief of Defense level, we're in complete agreement about the way ahead and about what we're giving them. I can't talk about the whole of government, but I can talk about it my level.
Well, I was pleased to see the realignment of Israel from UCOM to Centcom. I felt like that was the right move, and I was happy to see Centcom's combined naval exercise involving Israel, the UAE, Bahrain. That was last November. So how are you actively working with partner nations to integrate the IDF into the regional security architecture?
I think the low-hanging fruit is an integrated air and missile defense. All of these nations see the threat from Iran, the ballistic missile threat, the cruise missile threat, the unmanned aerial system threat, and they want to be able to defend themselves. And I think that's where we can make great headway involving Israel, but also other nations in the region. And I'll be able to talk a little bit more about that in the closed session.
Closed session. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, gentlemen, first, let me congratulate both of you on your upcoming retirements, and thank you for your collective 82 years of experience between the two of you. That's truly remarkable and outstanding service to our country, and certainly our nation owes both of you a debt of gratitude for your sacrifice and commitment, so thank you so much. In the last few months, the United States has announced the rerouting of $67 million of security assistance to the Lebanese armed forces to support members of the military as Lebanon grapples with some very severe financial challenges. Notably, the aid package will include some livelihood support payments, and these will go directly to troops to help them weather the extreme economic conditions that the country is facing right now. So, General McKenzie, my question for you, sir, is can you discuss why supporting the Lebanese armed forces is a national security interest for the United States, and more broadly, what the U.S. can do to support Lebanon during this time of severe crisis there?
Senator, I support the $67 million, and I support it more broadly as well. It's our view that the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, are the sole representative of the state of Lebanon in terms of defending itself. As you know, there are competitor entities in Lebanon, LH, Lebanese Hezbollah, as an example, that have an exercise a malign influence not only inside Lebanon, but indeed regionally from a Lebanon base. Our best hope to keep the lid on Lebanon is to continue to support the LAF as the representative of the state of Lebanon. And I'll just say briefly, the financial situation in Lebanon is dire. I am not an economist, but I can recognize it probably is the worst I have ever seen it. And this money is going to be critical to maintaining cohesion inside the LAF. And they have performed very well in the aftermath of the the Beirut port explosion. It was the LAF that did a lot of great work there. So I think it's in all our interests for the LAF to be supported and supported appropriately, and that would include allowing its soldiers to feed their families.
General McKenzie, my next question is for you as well. According to UNICEF, at least 47 children have been killed or maimed in Yemen just in January and February of this year. In total, at least 10,000 minors have been killed or injured since the Saudi-led coalition began their bombing in 2015. And this is in the context of a conflict in which the UN estimates nearly 377,000 people have died since the conflict began. And now the World Food Program is warning that 13 million Yemenis are facing starvation. My question for you, General, is straightforward. What leverage does the United States have to bring all the parties to the table to end this conflict, and what are we doing to make it happen?
Senator, so it's my assessment, and again, I only see a part of the problem. We have a negotiator who works this at a higher level. I believe that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is willing to come to an agreement with events in Yemen. I believe that is attainable from their end. I think it is the Houthis who are intent on continuing to prosecute this fight, and I believe they are prodded directly by their Iranian masters. And that's the reason that the situation exists now, where they're firing almost daily weapons into Saudi Arabia, and of course, as recently as several weeks ago, began to fire ballistic missiles into UAE. In both cases, they were and are prodded to do it again by their sponsors, Iran, who has no interest actually in this war coming to an end, no interest in solving the humanitarian dispute. And I do not dispute the tragedy, the tremendous tragedy of children being maimed by these weapons. Understand that completely. But there is a path forward. Some of the parties are willing to take that path. Unfortunately, not all of the parties are willing to take that path.
Well, I appreciate your efforts in working to try to get to that path. Thank you for that. General Townsend, in the spring of 2020, some of Michigan's National Guardsmen engaged with military partners in Liberia as part of Africom's Command, Advice, Investigations, and Coordination Initiative. I'd like to hear your assessment of how effective this initiative has been in promoting effective military legal frameworks within a variety of our African partners.
Well, Senator, much like our values and our democracy, we also try to pass on our views of the rule of law whenever we engage with our African partners. So that program that you're talking about is a part of that effort. And every training that we do has discussion about the rule of law and the law of armed conflict. And I think that program, you can debate how effective it is, but I think we have to actually try. Every time we engage with our African partners, it's important that we talk about our values and the rule of law and civilian control of the military, et cetera. So I think it's an important program.
Thank you, General. Again, congratulations to both of you on your retirement, a well-deserved. Thank you for your service to our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Hawley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to both of you for being here. General McKenzie, if I could start with you. You directed U.S. Army Central to investigate the events surrounding the Abbey Gate bombing on August 26, 2021. Is that correct?
Senator, that is correct.
And they issued, in fact, a report. Is that correct?
Senator, they did.
Totaling about, I think, 2,000 pages. You said in a letter to the Secretary, I have reviewed the investigation completed at my direction by U.S. Army Central and concur with and endorse the findings, end quote. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And do you stand by that, General?
I do.
Let's talk about some of the findings if we could. This committee has been told repeatedly, that the collapse of the Afghan security forces on such a rapid timetable couldn't be predicted. For example, General Miller testified to this committee, I'm going to quote him now, quote, there was nothing I or anyone else saw, end quote, that suggested the rapid collapse of Afghan security forces on the timetable that they did collapse. The Centcom report that you ordered, I think, to put it gently, casts some doubt on that. For example, it says General Miller, that's the commander on the ground, of course, as you know, General Miller was extremely worried from May 2nd onward about the rapid collapse of the security forces, especially as he was seeing key districts fall. Of course, General Miller also has testified to this committee that he warned you, General Milley, and Secretary Austin as early as March or April about the rapid collapse of the security forces. The report also says, quote, Rear Admiral Vasely provided assessments weeks prior to the fall of the Afghan government that the trajectory of Afghanistan was in a downward spiral and likely not recoverable, end quote. General, can you confirm for us, based on the findings in the report, that the administration was in fact warned that Afghan security forces and the government could collapse rapidly after we left? And by we, I mean our military forces who evacuated fully in July.
Senator, I'll answer that, but first I'd like to very briefly just talk about the Abbey Gate investigation. That was a narrowly scoped investigation to determine what happened at Abbey Gate. The quotations you're drawing from testimony inside it were not part of the formal final findings of the investigation. That doesn't mean they're accurate or inaccurate. They're just simply not.
They're in the report, though, General, correct?
There are 14,000 pages in the report involving a lot of testimony from a lot of people, and I'm sure they're in the report. However, they're not the reason the report was created, and that they were not in the formal final findings of the report, which was focused on the nature of the attack at Abbey Gate. Now, having said that, as early as, and I've testified here earlier today and in the past, as early as the fall of 2020, my recommendation was that not my recommendation, but my view was that if you go below 4,500 in Afghanistan, that would be a mistake, put us on a slope that we would not be able to recover from. And then also in the spring of 2021, General Miller and I were both agreed that 2,500 was a number that we could maintain in Afghanistan. That's not ultimately the number that was selected, but we had the opportunity, a full and free airing of our views, which I think is all any commander can ask. Another decision was made, which is the way the process is supposed to work.
Fair enough. Fair enough. You did, in fact, it sounds like to me, and the report certainly indicates, that the administration was warned and that you were ignored. This investigation contains other remarkable testimony about the State Department and the White House's disengagement. Let me just go through a little bit of that. Multiple sources said, for the record, for the testimony, that the State Department refused even to talk about a civilian evacuation until it was too late, that they delayed efforts to start evacuating Americans. For example, Brigadier General Sullivan told investigators, and I'm going to quote him now, quote, "Trying to get the embassy to discuss non-combatant evacuation operations was like pulling teeth until early August." He goes on to say the embassy didn't fully participate in evacuation planning until a week prior to the fall of Kabul. Another Marine said that as a result of the State Department's intransigence, quote, "we essentially planned the evacuation in about 5 days," end quote. General, is it fair to say the State Department's delays undermine the broader evacuation effort?
I think the Department of State always tries to find a solution to remain engaged in a country. It's alien to their nature to cut and run. They prefer to not do that. I would tell you that we were involved in a lot of discussions back and forth with the State Department beginning in the spring of that year, and even earlier, in fact, as we looked at possible contingencies for departure.
So, yeah, you said that you were engaged in discussions with the State Department. What the report shows is that the State Department refused, and frankly, the White House refused to engage until the very last minute. For example, this is the testimony, again, of Rear Admiral Vasily. On the morning of August 14th, he says, the ambassador there in Kabul finally got a call from the National Security Advisor Sullivan and Secretary Blinken, who told him, the ambassador, we needed to move. We had heard the night before that they were looking at a 2-week plan to get 250 personnel, U.S. personnel, to H-Kaya and get them out by 31 August. Vasily told him he didn't have 2 weeks, that he only had 24 to 48 hours. Vasily goes on, I'd like to know where this level of urgency to get these people in before August 15th was before, because it didn't exist until it became a crisis. I could go on and on here, General. You're right, there are thousands of pages here, and I want to thank you for ordering this investigation. I think that was the right thing to do. I wish this committee would show some interest in it. My staff and I have been through all of it that is publicly available. It is astounding, frankly. So thank you for ordering it. Thank you for what you were able to uncover. I again call on this committee to have hearings on this report, which is now in the public domain, much of it, and that frankly contains shocking information about this administration's total failure to plan for the collapse of the Afghan security forces, despite being warned about it for months upon months, and to withdraw American civilians in time before the tragedy at Abbey Gate, which led to the death of 13 service members. I've got more questions for you for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, as a member of the Intelligence Committee, I can assure the Senator that there were not months and months of warning of imminent collapse. That is categorically untrue, and I wish the Senator would get off of this hobby horse.
May I
Gentlemen,
open session?
Gentlemen, I will now recognize.
But, Mr. Chairman, the Senator just invoked me. Has the Senator read the 2,000+ pages report?
Senator Hawley?
Would you
Senator
like
Hawley,
to read it, Senator King?
Your time's expired.
Do you have any interest in it?
Senator Hawley, your time's expired.
Do you doubt what I'm quoting? Are you saying that I'm misquoting this evidence? Before the Senator impugns my integrity in an open session, I'd like him to at least do me the courtesy of reading the material that I'm quoting and engage with it.
I'd be glad to do so.
Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, I want to also reiterate what many have said here. Thank you for your service, exceptional service to our nation. I know you're facing retirement, and you're probably one of the things you're most happy about is you probably don't have to testify in front of this committee again, but we really appreciate all you've done for our nation. I wanted to follow up on the important questions Senator Warren had asked about civilian casualties. Nobody wants civilian casualties, of course. One question that wasn't asked, though, that I think is important, we don't target civilians ever, our military, do we? General McKenzie, General Townsend?
Senator, we do not target civilians.
General Townsend, in your experience?
You're absolutely right.
So we
Unlike
never
what
do
we
that.
see in Ukraine right now.
Right, but other countries do, correct?
I can only observe what you're seeing in Ukraine.
Ukraine, Syria, perhaps?
Many other places.
ISIS, Al-Qaeda. So we don't do that. It's just important to recognize and say that for the record, and I know that's been your experience and your command. You know, I was in, like a lot of senators, as part of a bipartisan delegation to the Munich Security Conference. I went on to do consultation with allies in NATO and the EU in London, and it was mostly about Ukraine, some Asia-Pacific issues. I was actually quite surprised how literally in every meeting our allies raised with me the Afghanistan withdrawal and how it undermined U.S. credibility and trust, particularly as it related to NATO allies that were also in the country. General, what do you recommend as our best way to regain that credibility? I didn't raise it. It was raised in literally every meeting with me, and it was quite a important experience that I had, that, hey, this is still having an impact. What would you say is the best way to reestablish that kind of credibility and trust with our allies, particularly NATO allies?
Senator, so I think there's still a thirst for U.S. leadership. There's certainly a thirst for it in my region, where I interact with chiefs of defense daily and have visited literally every one several times since we left Afghanistan. They're taken aback by it. They still believe that the United States remains their partner of choice and, in fact, their preferred choice. Now, NATO is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I would tell you that I think the things that we are doing with NATO right now are things that absolutely restore some of that.
Good.
I think it's, from what I see from my perch on the sideline at Centcom, looking into what European Command is doing and NATO is doing and this administration is doing, I think they're doing all the right things to reestablish that.
Okay, good. Thank you. I noticed that in your CENTCOM priorities, deter Iran is listed at the top. Is that your #1 priority?
Sir, that is my #1 priority.
And let me talk about, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the Quds Force, General Soleimani, starting in about 2004, 2005, supplied very sophisticated IEDs to the Iraqi Shia militias in Iraq. Over 2,000 American soldiers wounded in actions, over 600 killed in action because of those EFPs. For years, we didn't do much to hold Soleimani, the Quds Force, for accountable for this very devastating killing of our best and brightest. I was in a hearing when the chairman, then General Dunford, mentioned that Soleimani in particular may have learned the wrong lesson back then. You could attack Americans with impunity and not pay a price. Do you agree with that? I know you were very familiar with that, and this is prior to, of course, him being killed.
Well, I think he's an object lesson in that you can't attack Americans with impunity.
So you think that, were we able to reestablish some of the deterrence that General Dunford had talked about by killing him when he was looking to kill more American troops?
That contributed to deterrence being reestablished, and I think there was a factor in their calculation. The Iranians have never doubted our capability. Occasionally, they doubt our will.
And you think that's been reestablished now?
I think yes, but I think, as with all things with Iran, it's an extraordinarily complex subject, and I think there is deterrence, but it's what I would call contested deterrence. They still seek to push us out by hurting us, and they will continue to do so.
Let me ask one final question. You were quoted in a New Yorker article in December of 2020 titled "The Looming Threat of a Nuclear Crisis with Iran," where you were quoted as saying that a more immediate threat than the nuclear program is Iran's missiles. Two very quick questions. Did the Iranians target the consulate with this most recent missile attack on northern Iraq? And would re-entering the JCPOA positively or negatively impact Iranian ballistic missile capability, which you, I think, have rightly called out back in December as a much more immediate threat from them. So two questions on that. Were they targeting us?
They were not targeting us.
So we're sure of that?
I am sure of that.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And the second question?
Second question is, I think that's a hard question. I think, what you would like to do is, if you execute a JICPOA, you would want to go to limiting other elements of the Iranian portfolio. And that would be a bridge to get to where you're maybe talking about ballistic missiles. You're talking about proxy activities. So that would give you an opportunity to try to work that diplomatically.
But should that be part of the agreement?
Senator, I don't believe that the current, it is under the current profile that we're looking right now. I'm saying it could be, if you're successful in negotiating an agreement, it might lead you to an opportunity for further successful negotiations on other issues.
No, but I'm just asking, sorry, Mr. Chairman, in your personal opinion, do you think that threat, which you said is actually more immediate than the nuclear threat, should that be part of any agreement that we're trying to do with them right now? In your personal opinion, I know you're not negotiating it.
Right. I do not believe it is feasible to come to an agreement that incorporates both elements right now. I don't believe it's feasible in the world we live in, with the state of our negotiations with Iran. It's feasible to get to both those things at the same time right now.
Thank you. Thank you again, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Senator Sullivan. Senator Scott, please.
I want to thank both of you for your service, and I wish you the best of luck in your retirement. I hope you move to Florida. You'll enjoy the weather and the taxes. General McKenzie, I'm hearing that Middle Eastern fighters are right now joining the Russians and attacking Ukraine. Do you have any knowledge that this is true?
We believe that out of Syria, there are perhaps very small groups of people that may be trying to make their way to Ukraine, but I've got nothing beyond that, and I can talk a little more about that in the closed session. Very small. Right now, it's a very small trickle.
Okay. General McKenzie, the State Department says there's about 182 citizens left in Afghanistan to evacuate. Do you know if that's accurate, and is there anything Centcom's doing to help them?
So the number I'm tracking is about 153 U.S. citizens and about 2,100 long-term permanent residents that are there. Some people want to come out, some people don't want to come out. It's my understanding that if someone wants to leave and they're a U.S. citizen, they're going to be able to leave. And we have regularly scheduled flights that actually fly. Centcom is prepared to repatriate them when they come to what we would call a lily pad in the theater, whether that's in Qatar or in UAE, where they can be medically assessed and moved on, back to the United States if they're an American citizen. And we are fully prepared to support the lead agency in this, who is the Department of State.
Thank you. What has Central Command been doing to punish ISIS-K for the killing of our military personnel at Abbey Gate? And right now, do you think the ISIS-K is getting stronger under the Taliban or weaker?
I think we are concerned about the developmental trajectory of ISIS-K in Afghanistan. And in the closed session, I can talk a little bit more about what we're looking at when we look into Afghanistan, in particular at the ISIS elements that were associated with that attack.
All right. Move on to the Iran deal. It appears, and you talked to Senator Blackburn a little bit about this, that about $90 billion in sanctions relief might be awarded to the Iranian government, which then they'll be able to use to ferment more terrorism. So if that happens, what resources would Centcom have and our allies have to put up to be able to fight these proxies?
So, Senator, I've got to be honest with you. I'm not an economist. I'm not familiar with the economic impacts of that deal. I would say this, from where I sit, the number one objective that I've been given is we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And it would seem to me that approaching that through a diplomatic solution would be the best way to get to that end. I recognize there are second-order effects that might proceed from that in terms of sanctions relief, and I acknowledge that.
Good. You spoke a little bit earlier about more cooperation with Israel. Are there things that we need to be doing in the NDAA that would help make sure we continue to expand our opportunities with Israel?
So I think right now we're in a pretty good place in terms of cooperation with Israel. As the latest member of the Central Command area of responsibility, I think I have all the authorities and permissions I need to move forward on that.
Okay, Joe Townsend. If you look at these maps, you can see Communist China's got a lot of goals, has quite a few goals in Africa. One's to continue to develop military bases. So if they're continuing to be able to develop more military bases, including the one in Equatorial Guinea, what threats will that pose to the United States?
Senator, I can be more specific in closed session, look forward to that, but suffice to say, they're not on the Atlantic coast of Africa. That's going to put them several thousand miles closer to the U.S. homeland if they get a base on the Atlantic coast of Africa.
So this is a general question for both of you. You know, we've watched with the Ukraine situation, and we've been able to do sanctions against Russia, which it sure seems like that could have a positive impact and hopefully reduce their ability to, fund the war effort. How important do you think it is when we have an adversary, whether it's Russia or China or Iran, that we do everything we can to make sure they don't have the resources to continue to develop? And we should do everything we can to make sure that our citizens are not dependent on them for any resources, such as, in China's case, pharmaceuticals, things like that. Do you think this is important to make your job easier if we're not dependent on other countries?
Senator, it makes my job a lot easier if we have a whole of government approach to the problems that we confront. You know, the Department of Treasury, all the economic power of the United States, all the diplomatic power of the United States is wielded in concert and preferably as a substitute for the military element of power. That's by far the most effective way to obtain our goals.
I can't say it better than that.
Yeah. And do you think our military power should be the last thing we use?
I think yes, as a general principle, we have far more effective tools to address these problems. The military element of power should be in support of all other elements of U.S. national power.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. At this point, I will adjourn the open hearing. The closed session will reconvene at 12 noon in SVC 217. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony, and we'll see you shortly.